Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today's short podcast episode is largely based on information from an interview I conducted with Jeremy Applegate, the chief of the Wage and Hour Division for the State of Alaska Department of Labor. The plan is to release this episode in Spanish, Tagalog, Ukrainian, and other languages so that non-English speakers will also have easy access to this information. All workers in Alaska are entitled to fair pay and treatment under the law. Many workers are unaware of their rights, though, and this enables an employer to take advantage of them. The purpose of this podcast is to educate workers in Alaska about their rights to make sure that they are paid fairly and treated fairly. First things first, all workers in Alaska are entitled to a written contract at the start of their employment. When a worker begins work in Alaska, that person should sign a written contract from their employer before they begin work. The contract must explain three things. Number one, how much you will be paid. Number two, how often you will be paid. Number three, how you will be paid. There are four ways to be paid. The most common is by check. When an employer pays an employee with a paycheck, the employee must have a way to cash or deposit the full amount of the check. In other words, if you try to cash the check and the bank tries to collect a fee for cashing that check, the employee should ask their employer where the check can be cashed without having to pay that additional fee. It is legal in Alaska for employees to be paid in cash. If the employee has a U.S. bank account, then they can be paid by direct deposit to that bank account. It is becoming more common for employees to be paid with a bank card. However your employer chooses to pay you, it must be determined before you start, and it must be written out. Employees should ask at the time of hire how they will receive their final paycheck. This is especially important for seasonal workers and for those employees who may be returning to a home country outside the United States. If the employer plans to mail your final paycheck to you, make sure that this is agreed upon in advance and that the employer has the best address for you. You'll also need to have a reasonable time frame in which to expect that check. If you do not receive your final paycheck, contact your employer to make sure that the check has been mailed to the proper address. If there is a problem in receiving your pay after that, contact the Alaska Department of Labor at 907-269-4900. You do not have to be able to speak English to contact the Department of Labor. Ask for a translator in your language. One should be provided. Most workers in Alaska are entitled to the state minimum wage. The state minimum wage in Alaska is currently $11.73 per hour. There are a few exceptions, but if you are being paid less than $11.73 per hour, you should call the Alaska Department of Labor at 907-269-4900. Again, you do not have to speak English. Most workers in Alaska are entitled to overtime pay. There are two different ways to earn overtime pay. If you work more than 8 hours in a single day, then you qualify for overtime pay for each additional hour over that first 8. Overtime is your base pay plus half that base pay. So if you're making $20 an hour, then your overtime pay rate would be $30 per hour. If you are making the minimum wage of $11.73 per hour, then your overtime pay rate is $17.60 for each hour over 8 that you work in a single day. There is a second way to earn overtime pay in Alaska, and that is to work more than 40 hours in a single work week. So if you are scheduled to work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Saturday, that's a total of 48 hours. You should be entitled to 8 hours of overtime pay for that 48-hour work week. There are some jobs that do not earn overtime, but those are rare. To check to see if you are entitled to overtime, call the Department of Labor at 907-269-4900. About days off, there is no requirement that an employer in Alaska give an adult employee a day off. All workers under the age of 18, though, must have at least 1 day off per week. About breaks. An employer in Alaska is not required to give their employees any breaks unless they are under the age of 18. If you are an adult worker and you do get a break, there are two things you should know. One, if an employer is offering employee breaks, they cannot require the employee to clock out unless that break is 20 minutes or longer. If your assigned break is shorter than 20 minutes, that should be paid time, and the employee should not clock out. The second thing is that there are a few industry-specific standards under other laws that may require breaks. For example, the Transportation Safety Administration may require long-haul truck drivers to be off the road for a certain amount of time before they can get back on the road. So you should know if you're working in an industry where you think that you should be entitled to a certain amount of time off between shifts, call the Alaska Department of Labor at 907-269-4900 and they can assist you. About payroll deductions. Payroll deductions mean that money is being taken from your wages by your employer before you get your paycheck. Lawful payroll deductions are things like federal income tax or federal insurance contribution. When employees are receiving tips, the employer may reduce your wages based on those tips. Some of these are legally allowed, but it is possible for the employer to take too much. If the employer is deducting so much from your wages that your wages are no longer meeting the minimum wage, then that could be a labor violation. Please contact the Department of Labor at 907-269-4900 if you believe that your employer is reducing your wages too much based on your tips. A common authorized deduction is for room and board. These are very common in seasonal employment occupations such as in the fishing industry. If the employee is making minimum wage, then the employer cannot deduct more than $20 per day for room and board. If the employee is making more than the minimum wage, the amount for room and board can be any reasonable amount. There should always be a written agreement between the employer and the employee about what will be deducted out of the employee's paycheck before those deductions from the paycheck begin. There are unlawful deductions for such things as taking money out of an employee's paycheck because a customer left without paying. Another common unlawful deduction is taking money out of an employee's paycheck for damage of tools used for your work or for shortages at the cash register. If your employer is attempting to deduct your pay for what you believe is an unlawful reason, contact the Department of Labor. Transportation. An employer who provides, pays for, or agrees to provide or pay for transportation for an employee from their place of hire to the workplace shall, when the job comes to an end, provide that same employee with return transportation to the place they were hired or to a destination agreed upon by both parties. Return transportation must be provided on or after termination of employment for a cause considered good and sufficient, or for reasons beyond the employee's control, or after the end of the contract or the end of employment. Return transportation must be provided to the eligible employee when requested by the employee within 45 days after the end of employment. If an employer fires an employee to whom return transportation is due, return transportation must be provided unless the reason for firing is that the employee lied on their employment application, the employee was intoxicated on the job, the employee was fighting on the job, or the employee had unexcused absences from work for more than 3 scheduled working days in a row. Return transportation is not due if an employee voluntarily quits their position unless the employee's reason for quitting is that the employer lied about how much the employee would be paid, lied about the number of working hours, lied about the lodging that would be provided, or there are conditions of employment that are unsafe or unhealthy. When an employee is owed return transportation and immediate transportation back to the point of hire is unavailable, the employee is entitled to board and lodging provided by the employer, or $100 per day furnished by the employer to provide for the employee's living expenses. This is due from the date of termination until the date that transportation becomes available, or for 10 days, whichever occurs first. It's important that employees in the state of Alaska protect themselves. You should always keep an accurate record of the daily and weekly hours that you work. You should keep a separate record from your employer. What this means is that you are keeping track of your own hours worked. Employers, under the law, are required to keep records of their employees' work time. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just make honest mistakes. Other times, they actively manipulate or falsify the records. If you have your own records to rely on, this gives you evidence to get your full pay if you weren't paid everything that you were due. The easiest way to keep track of your hours is with a smartphone if you have one. Whatever means your employer is using to keep track of your hours, take a photo of it every single time you clock in and every single time you clock out. Save those photos, so if you ever need them, you have them. If you believe that your rights as a worker have been violated, you can email the Wage and Hour Division. Their email address is statewide.wagehour@alaska.gov. You can find that email address in the show notes. Or you can give them a call at 907-269-4900. A live person should answer that call Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays between 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Alaska time. Even if you are unsure if you have a legitimate labor violation to report, please call their office for help. When in doubt, go ahead and call. Remember, you do not have to be able to speak English to call the Department of Labor. You are safe to call even if you are working in the state of Alaska without a legal visa. The Department of Labor is tasked with helping all workers. They want everyone to be paid for the work they do in Alaska. You will not be reported to immigration for contacting the Department of Labor to ask questions or report unfair employment practices. This is very important to understand. All workers in Alaska, regardless of their status, are entitled to fair pay and fair working conditions. Even if you are deported back to your home country, you are still entitled for the pay you did in Alaska. Do not hesitate to contact the Department of Labor for assistance if you have not received pay for work you did in Alaska. Thank you so much for listening. We wish you the best of luck during your employment in Alaska. We hope you have a wonderful experience in our beautiful state. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call my office at 907-269-0123.